Hello, my name is Louisa Wood Ruby. I am head of research at the Frick Art Reference Library, and with me on your screen is Robert Kassler, Director of Imaging and Visual Resources at MoMA. It's our pleasure today to welcome all of you to the first of our four-part symposium, Technological Revolutions and Art History, co-organized by the Frick's Digital Art History Lab and the Museum of Modern Art.
Thanks. On your screen, you can see a list of the titles and links to sign up for the rest of the series, taking place on November 12th, January 14th, and March 11th. One housekeeping note: in the interest of time, we are not giving formal introductions for each speaker. You can find speaker bios in the chat box. There will also be a question and answer period at the end of the lecture today that will be run by Samantha Deutsch, Ellen Prekop of the Frick. Please feel free to type questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time.
Technological Revolutions in Art History is the second in a series of symposia the Frick is holding to explore how recent advances in technology can affect methodological changes in art historical research. The first was held in the spring of 2018 and was an exploration of the ways to harness existing tools in computer vision science for art historical research and advise their development. To this end, the symposium brought together professionals from the fields of computer science and art history to identify the precise technological needs for expanding image-based searching as a tool and a methodology. Videos of that event are available on the Frick's website, and I believe that the URL is in the chat box as well. And today's event is also being recorded, and most of the lectures will be in that on that same webpage in the next and upcoming weeks. Following that event, now 2.5 years ago, we realized the importance of bringing in a third group of specialists to the discussion, those involved in the actual creation of the digital images the new methodologies being developed must rely on. To that end, we partnered with Robert Kassler and his team from MoMA.
Developments in the field of digital preservation are advancing at a rapid rate, often without the input of art historians. So once again, bringing the two groups together is of paramount importance. It's also apparent that the advances made were not necessarily distributed or available equally to all cultures. We invited speakers to help us explore the ethics of digitization and how access and discoverability affect art historical research. Participants will explore the ways that technology has the potential to expand engagement with cultural heritage institutions and their collections, but also, ironically, to omit, introduce bias, legal restrictions, and problematize concepts of ownership and authenticity. And finally, on the last day of the series, we will hold lightning round talks highlighting current initiatives that use digital technologies in exciting ways.
I now have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for parts 1 and 2 of the symposium, Dr. Jessica Riskin. Dr. Riskin teaches history at Stanford University. Her latest book is The Restless Clock, A History of the Centuries-Long Argument Over What Makes Living Things Tick. Today, she will set the stage for the symposium with a discussion of how science and technology were historically linked to the humanities and outline the reason for their divergence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her talk today is titled, The Great Divorce, How Science and Letters Went Their Separate Ways and Why It Matters. Please welcome Dr. Riskin.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I grew up in New York City, and I love the Frick and MoMA for my, it's a lifelong love. And so I was especially happy to get this invitation. Of course, I was hoping to be there for real in person, but since that's obviously not possible, I'm very happy to be here virtually. So, the Great Divorce. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, nor in a galaxy far away, the same people routinely engaged in both the sciences and what we now call humanities, or letters as they were known about a century ago. And then within about 50 years, around the turn of the 20th century, a kind of tectonic shift occurred in intellectual geography that split the sciences and the humanities into two diverging continents. And it became a thing of the past to try and seek a whole integral understanding of the world. And I teach at Stanford, where Stanford was founded right in the midst of this moment of divorce in 1885. And the students at Stanford, you may know, traditionally divide themselves into the techies and the fuzzies. So teaching the history of science, my students are often, it's hard to say, probably most of them are techies, some of them are fuzzies. But I have a sort of acute personal reason for being interested in this divorce and in its reasons and consequences. Now, I think people generally regard the current isolation of the sciences from the humanities, and even from one another, in fact. I think the sciences are quite isolated from one another as well. People generally, I think, assume that this is just a necessary result of their sophistication and specialization. But I think actually extreme specialization is as much an effect as a cause of the isolation. That is, this divorce happened in a particular time and in specific places, principally in England, France, Germany, and the United States. I think it had particular historical causes in the form of political and industrial and commercial interests. And these included the rise of an industrial middle class, especially in England and America, whose members rebelled against the classical literary education of the old snobby, elitist, aristocratic old regime. The kind of local reasons included also the argument made by key members of this rising industrial middle class that imperial success required a kind of new regime of engineering capitalism, the burgeoning of a popular culture, a popular science culture, and industry, for example, in the form of popular science magazines, promoting the view that science represented an utterly distinct, sort of separate, uniquely powerful mode of understanding. So in other words, there were local, political, cultural reasons for this divorce. It was not fate. And here, just as now I want to give you my first slide. Here we go. Just as an example of this. This is in 1875, Josiah Mason, who was a Birmingham industrialist and mass producer of key rings and pens and pen nibs, founded Mason Science College, which later became the University of Birmingham. And it was like Stanford. It was founded 10 years earlier, but it was to promote a certain approach to the world, industry and manufacturing. And Mason specifically banned literary instruction. No letters will be taught, he said. And so Thomas Henry Huxley, who's on the left side of my slide, gave the college's inaugural address, and he devoted almost the whole thing to celebrating this banning of literary instruction. He said that for students whose mission it was to foster industrial progress, literary instruction would just be a waste of time. And he said that he thought this, he said, I know this will be diametrically opposed, this view will be diametrically opposed to those of the great majority of educated Englishmen. So he's sort of reveling in being a kind of a radical about that. Matthew Arnold said, no, in fact, it's not counter to the majority of Englishmen. Matthew Arnold, the poet and critic, objected to Huxley's argument, saying that, in fact, the science, not letters movement was now enjoying great popularity. It had advanced from the morning sunshine of popular favor to its meridian radiance, said Arnold. And he wanted to defend letters against this movement against them. Huxley had sort of picked a fight with Arnold by invoking him as the personification of literary culture. And Arnold rose to the defense of letters by saying that their job was the sort of essential human task of integration, relating the separate forms of knowledge and interpretation to one another, moral, scientific, aesthetic, social. Science and literature, Arnold argued, should be integral parts of the same task of knowing ourselves and the world. So this is to show you an example of the popular science industry that took up, this is the Popular Science Monthly, American magazine, took up Huxley's cause against Arnold. So Arnold said literary scholarship is scientific as long as it's rigorous and systematic, and science is literary as long as it has the writings of Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and Darwin. They're all part of the same integral task. the editor's table column written by Edward Humans, the editor of Popular Science Monthly, said obviously he didn't understand science or the scientific method. So my point is that this was really, this divorce between science and letters was not fate. It was specific to the late 19th century sort of cultural and political moment. People quite deliberately went about making it happen. Naturalists of the 18th and early 19th centuries, in contrast, had not offered their theories as scientific in an exclusive sense, but as integral works of interpretation deeply related to other domains of interpretive understanding. And I use the word naturalist to describe the authors of these older scientific theories, or I could call them natural philosophers, but not scientists, because before the late 19th century and the advent of this new kind of exclusive and isolated model of science, there was also no such creature as a scientist. And I'm always telling my students in my for example, in my scientific revolution class or in my courses in early science, I'm always telling the students not to use the word scientist. These were really not scientists before the late 19th century. So the word scientist first appeared in March 1834 as a passing joke in a book review by William Whewell, the philosopher William Whewell. And he was alluding to the growing specialization of the sciences. He remarked that there was no general name for practitioners of the sciences. And he considered various possibilities. He said philosopher, you can see on the right side of the slide, philosopher is too lofty, savant is too French, and the German Naturforscher, he says, translated into English, suggests nature poker, which is too undignified. And so finally he says scientist was the suggestion of an ingenious gentleman at the British a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Whewell died in 1866, which was a few decades before the word scientist really caught on. So he probably would be astonished to know how widely this sort of joking proposal caught on. Although, to be fair, he did suggest it more seriously later on. But I want to give you now two kinds of examples of what science looked like before there were scientists and before this great divorce. Both of the sorts of examples are from the history of the life sciences. The first involves the emergence of the idea during the 17th century that you could regard living beings as a kind of machine, so a mechanist theory of life, the idea that you could understand living things in the way that clockmakers understand clocks. And so that's the first sort of example. And the second one is the later development of the idea during the early 19th century that these machines, these living machines, were in fact in constant self-transformation. The idea that we now refer to as evolution, that these machines are always making and remaking and transforming themselves. These big important ideas in the history of life science grew out of approaches to the world that combined observation, experimentation, philosophy, artistic creation, historical narrative, theater, amusement, all sorts of things, performance, you'll see, all sorts of endeavors, as you'll see in a moment. So let's see, maybe that was a little premature. I'll go back a slide. So let's start in the 17th century with the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, who pioneered this idea that the natural world including living bodies could be understood as a kind of machinery in the way that a clockmaker understands a clock. But I want to start actually before Descartes with the sorts of artificial machines that he had as examples around him. He was surrounded by artificial lifelike machines. And so he actually, in formulating his mechanist idea of life, of living things, he drew on a tradition that went back centuries, and depending how you count, even millennia, a tradition of artificial lifelike machinery. So this is, it's true that the word robot is a 20th century word. It was coined in 1920 by the Czech playwright Karel Čapek from the Czech word robota, meaning drudgery or servitude. And robotnik is Czech for serf. And the word robot in both German and English referred to a kind of serf specific to Central Europe. So Čapek introduced the term robot in this play. You see from the first, you see it on the slide, a scene from the first performance of it in 1921. And he coined the term, the play was called RUR, for Rossum's Universal Robots. And the play is about a futurist dystopia in which human workers are replaced by these artificial humans, robots. Actually, they're more like clones than what we think of as robots, because their parts are grown in vats, and they're sort of, they're chemical rather than mechanical, chemically produced rather than mechanically produced. So robot is a 20th century word, but there was an earlier word for artificial humans and animals, which was automaton. And that comes from the Greek roots for self-moving. It reflects a central principle of ancient philosophy. Aristotle distinguished between living and non-living things by saying that while non-living things, inanimate things, move according to their natures, heavy things down toward the center of the earth, light things up towards the heavens, living things, in contrast, can move at will. They can move themselves at will. And so automata are inanimate objects that seem to borrow this defining feature of living things, of being able to move themselves at will. So the engineer Hero of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century AD, described lots of automatic machine, that is self-moving machines. And here are a couple examples. So this one, you can see that there's a basin at the bottom, a base at the bottom with a siphon in it. And there's a fountain pouring water into this base. And as the water fills up over the bend in the siphon siphons it out, so that the air is alternately being forced out of the base as water goes in, and then allowed back in as the water is siphoned out. And this causes the bird figure on the base to intermittently whistle and chirp and move about. When I was teaching, I taught, before going to Stanford, I was teaching at MIT. I had once a very smart, interesting engineering student who looked at these designs and said, well, really a siphon is just like a transistor. It has two states, either siphoning or not siphoning. And so anything that you can do with a transistor, you should be able to do with a siphon. And what's striking about that is that it's certainly not the way Hero of Alexandria looked at it, but so binary, the idea of a binary device is not at all the way he looked at it, although it is one way of understanding it. Now let's see. Here's another example with lots and lots and lots of chambers with siphons, and you can see that they would all be intermittently filling and emptying and filling and emptying, and the birds at the top would be whistling and chirping. Waterworks were an important category of automata in antiquity and the Middle Ages. So here's a 12th century, late 12th century example by Al-Jazari, an engineer of the Islamic Golden Age in Cizre. It was now Turkey on the Syrian border. And you can see that there's again a fountain, a peacock. The peacock is a fountain pouring water into this basin, which is, as the water level rises, the two floats at the bottom also rise. One float pushes forward this little figure holding powder, a soap powder, and then the other one pushes forward a figure with a towel to dry your hands. So people had lots of fun with hydraulic automata. In the late medieval and early modern periods, they were everywhere, ubiquitous on the grounds of palaces and wealthy estates. I'll give you an example from the late 13th century of the frolicsome engines at a castle in northern France that was the seat of the Comte d'Artois. They included mechanical, so that the machines are mentioned in the account books of the castle, which is how we know all the stuff they had. They had mechanical monkeys, they had an elephant, they had a goat, all sorts of things. And in the mid-15th century, the Duke of Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, left a catalog of the things that he had. So he said, a painting of 3 personages that spout water and wet people at will, a machine for wetting ladies when they step on it, an engine which, when its knobs are touched, strikes in the face those who are underneath and covers them with black or white, another machine by which all who pass through will be struck and beaten by sound cuffs on the shoulders, and so on and so on. So in other words, it was all this very playful machinery. The French writer Michel de Montaigne, when he went traveling through Europe in 1580 and 1581, kept a diary in which he talked about all the things, all the automata that he saw, automaton lions and whole scenes from Greek mythology enacted and all sorts of things. This is a picture of my kids when they were little. My son Oliver on the left, when he was 4 years old, he went with me to the Schloss Heilbronn in Salzburg, where in 1612 the Archbishop of Salzburg had installed waterworks. What I discovered with Oliver was that 4 centuries have not made much difference to the taste of 4-year-old boys. And we know this because the doctor and caretaker of the young Louis XIII recorded his reactions to the waterworks, the hydraulic automata, at his castle at Saint-Germain-en-Laye around the same period, early 17th century. And so Oliver, like Louis XIII, my son Oliver was a bit nervous, but ultimately he was thrilled with these machines that would interact with him everywhere he turned. The scenery would belch water on him, and stone creatures would stick out their tongues, and he was completely thrilled and delighted by this. So I have a picture of him at Schloss Heilbronn. He's now in college. And then my daughter, I didn't want to leave her out. She didn't come with us on that trip. But okay, so I can show you some drawings from the hydraulic grottos. These are not from the Grand Duke's Palace, but similar ones by a French engineer and architect named Salomon de Coz. And so here you see his Galatea pulled by dolphins. So often these devices were programmed by organ barrel programming, and on the left side of the slide you can see the big camshaft, it's like a big version of what you see in a music box that organizes the motions. So the programming was by camshaft, by organ barrel programming. It's not entirely clear when this. Here's another example of Salomon de Coz. This is the Orpheus Grotto. So Orpheus is in the middle playing his music, and you see the animals all around who would move in time to the music. And here's a drawing of organ barrel programming by Athanasius Kircher, the German Jesuit philosopher from the mid-17th century. Organ barrel programming is probably much older than this, but this is an early example of an explanation of how it works. And here's a further example of organ barrel. You can see that this one is the barrel at the bottom is being alternately run by the water wheel or stopped by the bucket as it descends. It triggers a braking mechanism. So as it intermittently runs and stops, it triggers motions of the birds at the top of the slide. The birds are fluttering and chirping. Meanwhile, the owl is pivoting toward them, and when he faces them, the motion is braked by that bucket, and the birds are suddenly still and silent. And maybe I'll fast forward through some of these examples. I have so many examples, but many of them, one thing I did want to just point out is that many of them were from churches and cathedrals. Many of these machines were religious machines. Automaton Jesuses on the cross, automaton devils and angels, automaton reenactments of the Ascension of the Virgin, and all sorts of things like that. So here's a 15th, 16th century automaton devil. And here is a monk. This is my final example, another religious example, a religious automaton. This is a Franciscan monk that was built around 1560 and is now at the Smithsonian. And it has a twin at the Deutsches Museum in Munich. This monk paces, raises a crucifix and rosary, turns its eyes and head to look at the cross, moves its mouth in prayer. And it's quite extraordinary, quite compelling. It really, to watch, although it's very small, it has quite a powerful performance, powerful aura. So all of these machines helped to bring about a shift in which people began to think about the functions of living bodies in terms of artificial machinery. And this now brings me to Descartes, who pioneered the idea that the natural world, including living bodies, could and should be understood like artificial machinery in terms of moving material parts. And his theory of living things was an integral work of philosophical interpretation, drawing on this tradition of artificial lifelike machines and their performances and people's responses. So in other words, he was drawing upon all of the art and design and philosophy and performance and response that went into these machines. He lived for a time in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, near the French royal palace, where, as I mentioned, there were these grottos filled with hydraulic automata, Perseus and Andromeda, Orpheus with his lyre, Neptune astride a dolphin. And they engaged with spectators, spraying them with water or puffs of flour or coal dust, rushing to hide, coming forward to menace spectators. And Descartes emphasized that if artificial machines could engage, respond, interact in these ways, then why shouldn't living things be made of artificial machinery? Around the turn of the 18th century, so now I'm moving toward my second sort of example. Around the turn of the 18th century, the German rationalist philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz developed his own version of the idea that living things were essentially machines. Leibniz was the person who developed the notion of living things as organisms, a different kind of machinery, a kind of machines that are machinery all the way down, machines within machines within machines within machines all the way down, and all of them in continual self-transformation. So I'll read you a passage from Leibniz's New Essays. I took the title for my recent book from this passage, The Restless Clock. So the passage goes like this. He says, in German, the word for the balance of a clock is Unruhe. So he's writing in French. The New Essays are written in French. That's why he's explaining. In German, the word for the balance of a clock is Unruhe, which also means disquiet. And one can take that for a model of how it is in our bodies, which can never be perfectly at their ease. For if one's body were at ease, some new effective objects, some small change in the sense organs and in the viscera and bodily cavities would at once alter the balance and compel those parts of the body to exert some tiny effort to get back into the best state possible, with the result that there is a perpetual conflict, which makes up, so to speak, the disquiet of our clock, so that this appellation is rather to my liking. And the reason I find that so striking as that passage is that usually when you hear someone comparing a living organism to a clock, you think of a totally different set of attributes. I think you generally would think of regularity, imperturbability, precision, and instead we have something like their opposites here. We have disquiet, unease, exertion, conflict. So this is a very different model of living machinery that emerged in this period from a kind of inseparable combination of philosophy, machinery, arts. Leibniz also cited microscopic evidence in support of his claim. We'll come to those in a moment. I went a little too soon. He cited microscopic evidence in support of his claim that the tiniest particles of matter contained whole worlds of living machines, all of which were intrinsically active and self-transforming. And it was this model so now my next slide, it was this model that produced the first ideas of species change. So now we're at my second example of science before scientists. And before the Great Divorce. According to Leibniz's model, living beings were dynamic self-transforming mechanisms that did not receive their design and structure all at once at the beginning of time from a supernatural God, but rather God acted through nature and natural law, and the organisms themselves were continually transforming themselves over time and from within. So it was a notion of organization rather than design. Following Leibniz around the middle of the 18th century, this idea of a flux of living forms took hold especially powerfully in France. So in 1750, for example, the writer and materialist polemicist La Métrie, who's on the left side of my slide, gave it his own expression. He described in his writings, especially Man and Machine, 1748, he described a kind of machinery, living machinery, that was essentially active, sensitive, responsive, full of sensations and passions. It's actually rather sexy, his writing. So there he is looking characteristically jolly. And on the right side of the slide is the freshwater hydra or polyp that the Genevan naturalist Tremblay had studied, and he had this extraordinary result, which is that you can cut it up in pieces, and each piece will generate its own new organism. And that seemed like demonstration that living organisms could create and transform and reproduce themselves, or transform their own shapes. So La Métrie envisioned a process in which newer forms of animals emerged gradually from older ones, with certain animals managing to survive and reproduce, while others would lack the necessary parts and would die without reproducing. And over time, the whole sort of structure of living animal life would transform. So it was a sort of early notion of evolution. And we see a kind of general testing of this idea, this model of life, as living, self-making, self-transforming machinery in the explosion of projects in the 18th century to build machines that could eat, talk, play musical instruments, write, draw, perform other human tasks, and especially in the philosophical and cultural conversation surrounding these machines. So again, it's really a combination of philosophy, artistic creation, performance, spectacle. All of these things are inseparable. Even naming them separately like that suggests a kind of separateness that I think in the 18th century it was very integral and not separate. The 18th century experimental, artistic, philosophical tradition of living beings as self-transforming machines culminated in the work of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who was the villain of my high school and college biology classes, and for interesting reasons that I don't have time to talk about now, but I think it's interesting to wonder why, to think about why he was he fell so much out of favor. But he was indeed the author of the term biology, and of the first systematic theory of what we now call evolution, although he didn't use that word, but he thought of it as the transformation of living forms. And instead of appealing to an external source of agency, as in the traditional theological accounts of life, Lamarck naturalized living agency. He talked about a pouvoir de la vie, or a power of life, considering it a natural force, like the forces of experimental physics, like gravity or electricity or magnetism. And he described a process in which life began with the spontaneous generation of living matter from the action of different forces, electricity and magnetism, light and heat, on inanimate matter. You get the spontaneous generation of animate matter, and then you get the power of life acting in this animate matter, driving living matter toward greater and greater complexity. And then at each level of complexity, you get different forms of responsiveness. Organisms begin to respond to their environments in ways that transform them heritably. And as you move up the ladder of complexity, these forms of response become more sophisticated, so that at the level of birds and mammals, they can act by will. They can transform themselves by responding to their environment in acts of will. So the notorious example is the giraffe stretching its neck to reach high up leaves. That gets an incrementally longer neck in each generation, just the tiniest bit, but added together over many generations, you get the striking shape of a giraffe. So Lamarck was convinced that this was the only way to account for living things, that living things transform themselves. If each creature owed its organization to an entirely exterior and foreign source, then they would be totally passive machines. They wouldn't be living. That would not be living things. And so therefore he emphasized the influence of the moral on the physical, that is behaviors on physiology. And he recommended widening rather than narrowing one's field of judgment in philosophy. A scientific theory, he thought, was a work of interpretive judgment applied to many kinds of mutually acting influences. So here again is that older, interconnecting, integral, philosophical, and humanistic approach to science. Lamarck's theory of species change gave Darwin a place to begin. And although Darwin departed from Lamarck in crucial ways, he also presented this sort of, I think, especially early in his career, an integral approach to science, as I've been calling it. His theory of evolution, again, involved many forms and levels of causation, including natural selection through the struggle for survival and competition for finite resources, the behaviors of animals in response to their environments, the aesthetic preferences of animals choosing mates, which Darwin named sexual selection, and countless varieties of contingencies. So in other words, many sorts of cause operating at many levels and understandable in many ways. Darwin's explanations were scientific in a connected and inclusive rather than exclusive way, calling upon this mix of arguments that was historical and aesthetic, as well as anatomical and geological. In Darwin's wake, however, his followers reconstrued his theory so as to reduce causation to natural selection alone and render the evolving organism an entirely passive, designed machine. Some did so in order to accommodate God's monopoly on creation in the later 19th century, but what the reshapers of Darwinism had in common was an insistence that causal reduction and passive objects were distinguishing marks of modern science, setting it apart from all other modes of understanding. And so here entered in the later 19th century, again, the idea of science as an utterly distinct and exclusive endeavor. And one thing that's interesting to note is how that model of science goes together with a particular model of the objects of science as fundamentally passive, and describe. So the method and the objects imply one another and go together. The separateness and opacity of science, people generally assume, I started off by suggesting, people generally assume that the separateness and opacity of science is built into the progress of natural knowledge. But I suggested at the beginning of this talk, I think it was a product of its time, of the imperial, industrial, commercial, also racial, although I haven't talked about that today, religious, social class preoccupations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To be sure, in some scientific fields, people were recognizing the necessity of interpretation and a kind of a more integral interpretive understanding in important new ways. An example of this is Niels Bohr's and Werner Heisenberg's Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics around 1927, in which the scientific and philosophical elements were inseparable. So I think, it's not true that all science has adopted this new model across the board, but in politics, in popular culture, in institutions such as universities, the divorce prevailed. And I think the legacy of this divorce has been the loss of an integral project of understanding by and large, and the onset of a kind of fractured worldview in which the project of discovering facts and the project of offering creative interpretations appear to be separate when, in fact, they are inseparable. Perhaps by studying the origins of our current splintered approach to understanding, we may find new sources of intellectual integrity and wholeness. Such integrity would not be a panacea, but I think it would be a prerequisite to addressing the many other fractures that have left our society breaking to pieces like the polar ice caps under global warming. I apologize for that rather dark ending, but I was feeling a little bit dark when I wrote it. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.